Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you might happen to be watching this. I'm glad that you've tuned in to watch Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church's Sunday School. My name is Sam Lamerson, in case you don't know. No reason for you to know other than I've been around here for a long time and I look like this. But today we want to look at the next book of the Hebrew Bible. That is, last week we looked at Psalms. This week we want to look at the book of Proverbs. I'm sure that the book of Proverbs is a book that you have heard of, just like Psalms, and it's probably a book that you have dipped into and read here and there. There's a reason why Proverbs are so popular, similar to the reasons why we looked at last year that the book of Psalms was so popular. One is they speak to our need for wisdom in the midst of foolishness. We find foolishness all over the world today, and especially in the United States political system. There's a lot of foolishness, a lot of things being said that aren't true, all kinds of conspiracy theories that go here and there, and we need true wisdom, the wisdom of God. And as a result, reading the book of Proverbs is a helpful thing. Another reason is that the Proverbs can be read one at a time without much loss of context. We talked last week about how the versification of the New Testament has done as much harm as it has good. And the versification of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament has just as many sorts of problems. But in the book of Proverbs and in the Psalms, you can read one psalm and get what the author is going at. You can read one proverb and get what the author is trying to say to us. And so as a result of that, you can just read this one sentence and sort of figure out what's going on. The Proverbs are often well known in today's world. There are lots of things that people say that have their basis in the Proverbs. And as a result, reading through the Proverbs will often remind you of things that you thought came from somebody else, like Mark Twain or Shakespeare, and originally they were in the text of the Scripture. Here's a picture for us to sort of remind ourselves of what Proverbs is all about. First of all, we see a proverb, a fool and his money are lucky to get together in the first place. Then we see an owl, and the owl is to remind us that this book is a book about wisdom. It's a book of wisdom literature, just like the book of Psalms, just like the book of Job. These are all pieces of Hebrew wisdom literature. And this owl reminds us that we are looking for what are called proverbs. They are pithy statements that have some sort of picture of wisdom for us for living. They're not like a whole story that Jesus tells, which is a parable. But Jesus also has some proverbs, some very small, pithy statements, usually of only one sentence, sometimes two sentences. And those kinds of things are often very helpful for the learner to take away with them. And so if we think about Jesus' statements of pithy sayings, there are things like, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. You have heard that, I'm sure, many times. Many of you have been misinformed that actually was, there was a gate for camels, and the camel had to get down on his knees and take away all of his burdens and crawl through there, and that was called the eye of a needle. That's not the case. When Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven, he means it's easier for a camel, the animal, to go through the eye of a needle. And Luke uses the word for surgical needle, Greek word for surgical needle, and so he means exactly what that says. It's a very striking illustration to sort of see a giant camel that would have been and still is all over the place in Israel today. You'll see them all over. To think of one of those often very large animals that going through the eye of a needle is something that we almost can't imagine. It's a comedic image in many ways. And that's what the Proverbs are. They are in many ways a sort of comedic image, an image that reminds us of what's going on. So let's take a few minutes and think together about what the book of Proverbs is really all about. First of all, we remember that wisdom begins with fearing and trusting God. That real wisdom doesn't come from education. It doesn't come from reading lots of books. We've all known people who were really, really well educated, and yet they fell victim to some sort of scam that a little child should have seen the problems with. There are all kinds of examples of this in the history of the world, where people who seem to be very well educated simply didn't have what they needed in terms of real wisdom. And so, since this theme of the book of Proverbs is that wisdom begins with fearing and trusting God, we can realize that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's one of the Proverbs, that until we fear the Lord and know the Lord, then there is no real wisdom with us. Next, we should look at where Solomon lived, and that is, here is the basics of Solomon's kingdom. Now, we'll realize in a minute that Solomon didn't write all of the book of Proverbs. That's a common sort of way of thinking about Proverbs, that they're all written by this wise man Solomon, and that's who we should realize had all this wisdom to pass on to us. But that's not really what is going on there. What's going on there is that there are other people who also have written, and some of them, they collected the sayings of Solomon, and some of them are written by other people. But just so you know, this is a pretty careful outline of how big Solomon's kingdom would have been. Remember that this is the time before the divided kingdom that we get to after the time of Solomon, when Judah and Israel divide between one another. Here's a timeline. Remember that Solomon is king of Israel until about 931, and again, these dates are approximate. But then it's very shortly after that the land divides into northern and southern Israel. And then we have Assyria conquering Israel. Then there's this king named Hezekiah, who was the king of Judah. You know, you've heard of him. You've heard about his prayers. You've heard about God telling him that he was going to die, and him praying, and God giving him an extra bit of years because of his prayer. The prayer of Hezekiah is a wonderful example to us of how God answers prayer. But in the knowledge of the book of Proverbs is that Hezekiah gathered some of the Proverbs that were written by Solomon and not collected, and collected them down into the book. So if we look at the book of Proverbs, we can see that this is essentially what we have. The first 9 chapters are instructions from a teacher to a student. We don't know who that teacher was and who that student was. But if you read the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs, you get a sense that it's different from the rest of the book. And it claims to be different from the rest of the book. It's not part of the book that was written by Solomon. Years ago, I had an advanced course in just Hebrews 1 through 9, and we went through it very, very carefully in the Hebrew text, looking at Hebrews 1 through 9. In our final exam, we had to be able to translate from the Hebrew with no helps, no lexicons, nothing, anything from Proverbs 1 through 9. And so I read through Proverbs 1 through 9 in English a lot. I remember making a cassette tape of Proverbs 1 through 9 and listening to it as I drove around. I remember reading through the Hebrew text very carefully so that I would know exactly what I was supposed to do. And as I did that, I stumbled onto something that I'll tell you about toward the end of the lesson, where Matthew and Proverbs sort of linked together. But then starting in chapter 10, we have the Proverbs of Solomon. This goes on until chapter 22. These are the Proverbs that are actually written by Solomon himself. Then in chapter 22, verse 17, there's a division, and it says, these are the words of the wise. We don't know exactly who this wise one or these wise ones were, but then starting in chapter 25, we again go back to Solomon, and we get the Proverbs of Solomon collected by Hezekiah's men. So they went out and collected apparently other Proverbs that had not been in the Proverbs that Solomon had written down himself. Then in the last couple of chapters, 30 and 31, there are the words of Agur and Lemuel. And here there are some very interesting things. The last chapter of Proverbs, of course, is that chapter about a wonderful woman or a wonderful wife and how she works and she rises up early. She does all of these things that are necessary. The words from Agur in chapter 30 tell us that we should look for something that Aristotle later calls the golden mean. He says we don't want to have too much money and we don't want to have too little money. We pray that God will give us enough money, because having too much money brings with it almost the same number of problems that having too little money does. So let's just think for a few minutes about who actually wrote the Proverbs. We've given that in an overview. Many automatically think of Solomon as the author. And I remember in Sunday school once mentioning that Proverbs 1 through 9, we don't know who wrote that. And someone was a little upset that I was saying that Solomon didn't write all the Proverbs. And I pointed them to the actual text of Proverbs 1 through 9, they began to realize that the text itself says this is not by Solomon. It may very well have been Solomon going down into Egypt to learn from the learned men of Egypt and coming back with notes that could have been where they came from. We don't know any of that for certain. But according to the outline above, there were a number of writers of these short wisdom sayings. And it's similar in many ways to some of the wisdom sayings that Jesus has. He says, for example, remember, don't take the speck out of your brother's eye before you take the log out of your own eye. Again, this is the Hebrew overstatement. It would have been comedic. It would have been funny to those who were listening. And so the fact that this text tells us that different people wrote these different parts of Proverbs is different from the headings of the Psalms. We know that the headings of the Psalms were not written at the same time that the Psalms were written. So we don't know for sure how much we can trust them. On the other hand, this is the actual text telling us whom these Proverbs were written by in some cases, and in some cases not telling us whom the Proverbs were written by. So one of the things that we should always ask whenever we're looking at a part of the Bible is, how do the Proverbs point to Jesus? Because we believe that the Hebrew Bible points toward the coming Messiah. The Gospels tell us about the death and resurrection, birth, death, and resurrection of the Messiah. And the epistles explain to us exactly what has happened. That's why Pastor Rob is preaching through all of the books of the Bible, at least giving us an overview of them, to point to us that this is all God's plan that is working out. How is it then that the Proverbs point to Jesus? One way is that the personification of wisdom is a very common theme in the Gospels. Jesus is often seen as wisdom personified. That is, if you refuse to listen to what Jesus says, then you end up being a fool, just like in Proverbs. So a couple of examples of this are in John 1:19, the true light, and the way that you see anything is to get light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. And so we recognize here that Jesus is showing people what is really the truth. Then there's another passage written by Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:24, but to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And so from there you see very clearly that the text itself of the New Testament is telling us that Jesus is the wisdom of God. Now we have to come to the question of what's going on in Proverbs. And as you read through the book of Proverbs, it's particularly evident in 1 through 9, but it's evident throughout the whole book. Wisdom is personified. By that I mean wisdom is treated as a person, usually a female person. And there are places like Proverbs 9 when wisdom and folly sort of get into a battle with one another. And that's perhaps one of the most clear examples of the Proverbs pointing to Christ. This is a specific example from Proverbs 9 and from Matthew 22. Proverbs 9, and you can take your scriptures out and look at Proverbs 9 yourself, and you'll realize that as you read through the whole chapter, it's not like some of the other Proverbs where they're just a one-sentence saying. Proverbs 9 is telling a story. It could almost be called a parable. And inside the city, there are these two people calling. On the one side of the city, there's wisdom is calling for people to come to her banquet. And on the other side of the city, folly is calling for people not to come to her banquet, but to come and live in this party that she is having. And at the end of chapter 9, it says those who go to the party that folly is having, they actually end up living in this a house full of the dead. They end up living in Sheol. And so this battle between wisdom and folly is very clear and very parabolic in the Proverbs chapter 9. Because the writer of Proverbs doesn't mean for us to think that there's an actual wisdom person and there's an actual person called folly. It means for us to think about the fact that what's really going on here is that God, and who is wisdom, and folly, who is a lack of God and thus a lack of wisdom, are in this battle with one another. And folly calls for these same people to come, as wisdom has already called to come and come to her party or her feast that she has prepared. In Matthew 22, the king prepares a feast, and there are a number of similar unusual words that are used in the Greek of Proverbs 9 and the Greek of Matthew 22. I have a paper that I've written on this years ago. I published it in a journal, and it's probably floating around the internet if you want to look at it. It's something like, called something like Matthew 22 echoes Proverbs 9, something like that. If you Google my name, you'll probably be able to find it. And essentially what I argue is that in Matthew 22, there is this great feast that is called for by the king, and people don't want to come. They give all kinds of excuses for not coming to the feast. One has to go and do this, and one has to go and do that. And eventually, God sends his people outside of the city and asks for people outside to come into the feast. I think it's symbolic of the Gentile mission. That is, that when Jesus came, at first he was speaking exclusively to the Jewish people. But as he went on, he began to be speaking more and more to those who were outside the city, outside of Jewish people, and speaking to everyone. And that's what's going on there. And if you look at some commentaries on Proverbs, they picked up that idea that I happened to stumble upon, and we'll focus on it as well. There are a couple of interesting questions that we should ask as we think about this book of Proverbs. One is, how could a man so wicked as Solomon write with such great wisdom? You remember from our going through 1 Kings that Solomon was a wise man, but he also had some problems. In 1 Kings 11, we remember that he had 700 royal wives, 300 concubines. His wives had a powerful influence over him. When Solomon became old, his wives shifted his allegiance to other gods. and he was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his father David had been. Solomon allowed his large number of wives. I mean, these numbers are rounded off, certainly, but he allowed the large number of wives that he had to sort of shift the truthfulness that he knew. He knew who the real God was. He knew where wisdom was. But this allowed Solomon it caused Solomon to shift away from that knowledge. And so we ask, how could a person as wicked as Solomon write these beautiful, wise things? And there are a couple of things to remember. One is, Solomon didn't write all the Proverbs. He wrote some of them. Some of them he wrote, and some of them he didn't. And so some of the wisdom that we find in Proverbs, it was not written by Solomon. But second, the wisdom that God gave Solomon is, in many ways, it seems, for running the kingdom, getting things built, like getting the temple built, and not so much for worshiping God. And as a result of that, we should pay special attention to what's going on there and what it is that God is saying through the life of Solomon. Solomon's life was not perfect, and his wisdom was not perfect. And the only one who has absolute perfect wisdom is wisdom personified, and that is Jesus Christ. The third thing to remember is that this seems to be a strong argument against polygamy. You will often hear the question among people who know something about the Bible yet don't believe it. They will say, why didn't God condemn polygamy? Abraham had several wives, and Solomon had apparently 1,000 different women, 700 wives, 300 concubines. The thing to remember, though, is that when we see these people with a multitude of wives, it ends up causing them problems. Whether it might have been David and Bathsheba, Abraham and Sarah, or Solomon and his thousands of women whom he lived with, the truth of the matter is that they all caused him significant problems. And that in itself, I think, is an argument against polygamy. There's one last proverb that I think we should look at. And that is this particular proverb that is brought up by many, many people. It's said, train a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it. Obviously, this means either he or she. It's just a masculine proverb, the masculine pronoun used there in the proverb. But what are we to say about that? We've all known people who it seems like they've raised their children very well. It seems like they've done the best that they possibly could, and yet their children go away from the gospel. Well, this is the expected consequence of such training. That is, if they are trained correctly, they will go through their life remembering this training. The sages were confident that certain kinds of people needed different kinds of training, and certain kinds of character in a person sort of pointed them toward different kinds of abilities. And the character-forming quality of the training would cause them to do their work for God. However, Proverbs are not universal, and you can anticipate positive results from careful child training, but there may be an exception. And we ought not to judge a parent or a family simply because they have a child that has left the faith, perhaps only for a while. Perhaps they will come back. There are a lot of children and young people that are leaving the church these days, and I pray that the Lord will bring them back once they begin to realize what's going on. Perhaps ending up, we can think of this proverb, which is from Solomon, and essentially what it says is if we do what God says we should do, then our work will be established. Commit your work to the Lord and your plans will be established. So I hope that you will take that one proverb and you'll realize in the midst of the COVID virus in which work is different, some people are looking hard for work, I hope that you'll remember to commit your work to the Lord and allow Him to establish your plans. Thank you, and we will see you again next week on Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School.